It was late November, and I had just started my first week working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store. The store was in a quiet part of town, and most nights, we barely saw any customers past midnight. I wasn't thrilled about working alone, but the extra pay was hard to pass up. The night had been uneventful. A few people came in for cigarettes or snacks, and by 2 a.m., the place was silent again. I sat behind the counter, scrolling through my phone and listening to the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. The rain outside had picked up, hitting the windows in steady rhythmic taps. I was halfway through a video when the automatic door slid open with a soft hiss. I looked up, expecting a customer, but no one was there. The wind must have triggered the sensor, I thought. I walked over and peered outside, seeing nothing but the rain-soaked parking lot. I shrugged it off, went back to my seat, and tried to focus on my phone again. But after a few minutes, the door slid open again. This time I watched them closely, waiting for someone to walk in. Nothing, just the sound of the rain and the cold night air creeping inside. Feeling uneasy, I stepped outside to check the sensor. The rain soaked through my jacket as I scanned the empty lot. The only other light came from the flickering street lamp near the road. I didn't see anyone, but as I turned to head back inside, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the far edge of the lot, just barely visible in the rain. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the store. My stomach dropped. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound confident. "We're closed." That wasn't true, but I didn't care. The figure didn't respond. After a few tense moments, I hurried back inside, locking the doors behind me. The minutes dragged by, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing at the security monitors, but the figure never approached the store. Still, I felt trapped, like I was being cornered without even realizing it. Around 3 a.m., the power flickered. The lights dimmed briefly before coming back on. I cursed under my breath and checked my phone, but of course the signal was spotty. I was about to grab the landline to call my manager when I heard it, a faint tapping on the glass door. I froze, turning slowly. I saw the figure standing right outside the doors now. I couldn't make out their face through the rain, but their silhouette was unmistakable. They tapped again, this time louder. "Sorry, we're closed," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure tilted their head as if confused, and then raised a hand. I realized they were holding something. It took me a moment to recognize it, a knife, glinting faintly under the flickering street lamp. I stumbled back, grabbing the phone and dialing 911. My hands were shaking as I tried to explain the situation to the operator. They assured me an officer was on the way, but it would take at least 15 minutes. The figure tapped again, harder this time. The glass vibrated with each knock. Then, without warning, they stepped back and vanished into the darkness. I didn't dare move from behind the counter. The rain continued to pour, and every sound outside made me jump. By the time the police arrived, the parking lot was empty, with no sign of the person I'd seen. The officer took my statement, nodding grimly as I described what had happened. Before he left, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "There's been a string of incidents like this in the area," he said. "Same description. Standing in the rain, holding a knife. But they never break in, and no one's been hurt yet." That was almost a year ago. I don't work the night shift anymore, but sometimes, on rainy nights, I still think about the figure. I don't know who they were waiting for, but I'm just glad it wasn't me. It was one of those nights when everything seemed off. I was working the late shift at a small convenience store just off the highway. There wasn't much around for miles, just trees, fields, and a few scattered houses. Most of the time, I'd have a few stragglers coming through late at night, but this night the place was eerily quiet. The rain had started falling heavily around 11 p.m., and by midnight it was coming down in sheets, pounding against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists. I was about to finish stocking the last of the shelves when the door chimed. A man entered. He was tall with shaggy hair and a long coat, and he moved like he was carrying some weight on his shoulders. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another traveler stopping in to get out of the rain, but there was something about him that set my nerves on edge. He didn't make eye contact when he walked in. He just headed straight for the back of the store, where the restrooms were, without saying a word. I shrugged it off, but something nagged at me. There was no reason for him to go back there at this hour. I went back to what I was doing, trying to ignore the creeping feeling in the pit of my stomach. A few minutes later, I heard the restroom's door swing open. The man stepped out, but this time he was holding something heavy in his hands, wrapped in what looked like an old blanket. He walked to the counter and set it down in front of me, his face still hidden in the shadows of his hood. "Is this all?" I asked, my voice a little too shaky. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the blanket. I felt an overwhelming urge to look at whatever he had brought in, but something told me not to. I rang him up quickly, trying to hurry through the transaction. The man paid in cash, and without another word, turned and walked out, leaving the blanket on the counter. It wasn't until he left that I took a closer look at what was wrapped inside. I don't know why I hadn't before, but I unwrapped the blanket carefully, my heart racing. Inside was a bundle of clothes, all soaked through with rain. But under the clothes, there was something else. A small, child-sized hand. I nearly dropped the blanket. I backed away, knocking over a stack of magazines as my heart pounded in my chest. I thought I was going to be sick. I grabbed the phone and called the police, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial. When the officers arrived, I showed them what was inside the blanket. They took it immediately and questioned me about the man, but I didn't have much to tell them. I never got a good look at his face, and I hadn't seen him leave. They searched the area, but by the time they went through the parking lot and into the woods behind the store, there was no sign of him. The strange thing was, they never found the child. There was no missing person report, no news coverage, nothing. The blanket had been empty when they checked. A few weeks later, I learned that the rest stop had been the site of a series of disappearances from years ago. Kids, mostly. Each one had vanished without a trace, and no one had ever figured out why. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the man who came into that store wasn't just a passerby. Whatever he was carrying, it wasn't just a bundle of clothes, and I don't think I'll ever forget the look of his eyes, barely visible under the shadows of his hood, when he left. This happened 3 years ago when I moved into a rental property with my younger brother. We were both in our early 20s and trying to save money, so we found a cheap older house on the outskirts of town. The rent was suspiciously low, but the landlord said it was because the house had been vacant for a while and needed some TLC. Neither of us cared much about the condition. It was cheap, close to work, and seemed like a great deal. The house itself was odd. It was long and narrow with a strange layout that didn't quite make sense. The front door opened into the kitchen, and the living room was tucked behind it, separated by a narrow hallway. The bedrooms were at the far end of the house, and there was a small, almost hidden door in the hallway that led to a crawl space. The landlord told us not to worry about the crawl space and suggested we keep the door locked. When I asked why, he shrugged and said it was just better that way. I thought it was a weird comment, but I didn't push it. For the first week, things were uneventful. We spent most of our time unpacking and settling in. The house had a cold, damp feeling to it, but we figured it was just because it had been empty for so long. The weirdness started on the 7th night. It was around midnight, and I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint noise. At first, I thought it was just my brother moving around in his room, but the sound was too soft and rhythmic. It was coming from the hallway, near the crawl space door. Knock, it wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. My heart started racing. I got out of bed and opened my door, peeking into the hallway. It was dark, but I could see the crawl space door clearly. It was closed just like we'd left it. I stood there for a moment, listening. Silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house settling or an old pipe. I went back to bed and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I told my brother about it. He laughed it off and said I was probably imagining things. "Old houses are creepy," he said. "You're just psyching yourself out." But the next night it happened again. The same soft, deliberate knocking. This time my brother heard it too. We both stood in the hallway, staring at the crawl space door. The knocking stopped, and we looked at each other, unsure of what to do. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. My brother protested, saying we should just leave it alone, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was making that noise. The door was locked just as we'd left it. I unlocked it and slowly pulled it open. The crawl space was pitch black, the air damp and stale. I shone the flashlight inside, and at first I didn't see anything, just dirt walls, cobwebs, and old insulation. But then I noticed something in the far corner. It was small and looked like a bundle of cloth. I stepped back, suddenly feeling like I shouldn't be there. My brother urged me to shut the door, and I did. We locked it again and tried to convince ourselves that whatever was in there didn't matter. The knocking stopped for a while after that, but things started getting stranger. We'd find lights on in rooms we hadn't been in. Doors would creak open on their own. One night my brother swore he heard someone whisper his name while he was brushing his teeth. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I was home alone, working on my laptop in the living room. It was late, maybe 1 a.m., when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I froze, staring at the doorway, waiting for my brother to appear, but he wasn't home. The footsteps stopped right outside the living room. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I heard it. This time it was on the living room wall, right next to where I was sitting. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the house, waiting in my car until my brother got home. I told him what had happened, and we agreed that we needed to leave. We moved out the following weekend. A few months later, I ran into the landlord at a grocery store. He asked how we liked the house, and I told him we'd left. When I mentioned the strange noises, his face turned pale. He hesitated for a moment before saying, the last tenants complained about that too, something about the crawl space. When I pressed him for details, he shook his head and muttered, sometimes it's better not to know. To this day, I don't know what was in that crawl space, and I don't want to. Whatever it wasn't just in the walls. It was in the house, and it didn't want us there. It started as a quiet night like any other. I had just finished dinner and was settling into my usual routine, scrolling through my phone in the living room, half watching a show in the background. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows, and the occasional gust would shake the trees in my backyard. I live alone in a one-story house surrounded by dense woods. It's peaceful most of the time, but nights can get unsettling if I let my imagination run wild. Around 10 p.m., I heard a faint knock at the back door. I froze, the sound catching me off guard. No one should have been out there. My backyard is fenced, and the gate is always locked. Cautiously, I got up and walked to the kitchen, which has a clear view of the back door. The porch light was on, but there was no one there. I stood there for a moment, staring through the window, my breath fogging up the glass. Then I saw it, a smudge on the glass right at eye level. It wasn't there earlier, and it looked like the impression of a hand, long fingers pressed against the pane. My stomach tightened as I realized it was too high up to be a child's hand and too slender to be a typical adult, so I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe just a trick of the light. Still, I locked the door and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again. Knock. This time, it was at the side window in the living room. My heart raced as I turned toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but the silhouette of something or someone was clearly visible, standing just outside. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. The operator told me to stay on the line and wait for the officers to arrive. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard a new sound, a scraping noise, coming from the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a metal candle holder, and crept toward the door. My hands trembled as I peered through the peephole. There was nothing there. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the bedroom at the end of the hall. It sounded like glass shattering. I ran toward the door, ignoring the operator's plea to stay inside, and bolted out of the house. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's driveway, where I waited for the police. When they arrived, they searched the house and found the bedroom window completely shattered. But that wasn't the worst part. On the bed, they found muddy footprints, large, human-like, but with clawed toes. The prints led from the window to the closet, but the closet was empty. No sign of anyone. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't stayed in that house since. I keep wondering what would have happened if I had stayed just a minute longer, or if I had opened that door. This happened about 6 years ago, when I moved into my first home. I had just turned 30 and was excited to finally own a little place of my own. It wasn't huge, a modest 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, but it was perfect for me. The house had been vacant for over a year, which explained why it was so affordable. It had a bit of a fixer-upper vibe, but I liked the idea of making it my own. The first couple of days were spent unpacking and cleaning. I noticed some quirky features in the house, things the previous owner had installed. like strange little shelves near the ceilings in a few rooms. I figured they were for knickknacks or plants and didn't think much of it. But the basement gave me the creeps from the start. It was unfinished, with low ceilings and one single dim light bulb hanging from a chain in the center. The walls were lined with old, dusty shelves filled with random junk the previous owner had left behind. Rusty tools, empty paint cans, even a doll missing one eye. On my third night in the house, I was woken up by a noise. It was faint, but unmistakable. A tapping sound coming from the walls. At first, I thought it might be a rodent problem. The house was old, and I hadn't had a chance to really inspect everything yet, but the sound wasn't scurrying or scratching. It was deliberate, rhythmic tap, then a pause, then again tap. I got up and walked around the house, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the wall in the living room near the floor. I knocked on the wall, half expecting something to scurry away, but the tapping stopped. I figured I must have scared off whatever it was and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time the tapping was louder and it seemed to move. First, it was in the living room. Then, it was in the hallway. By the time I worked up the courage to investigate, it had stopped again. I told myself it was just an animal in the walls and made a mental note to call an exterminator in the morning. But the morning brought something new. As I was getting ready for work, I noticed a small piece of paper sticking out from under the basement door. I froze. I hadn't opened that door since moving in, and I certainly hadn't put anything there. With trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "Don't open the walls." My heart was racing. I had no idea what to make of it. Was this some kind of joke? Had someone been in my house? I decided I couldn't go to work until I figured out what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the basement door. The basement smelled musty and damp, and the light bulb barely illuminated the space. As I descended the stairs, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On one of the shelves was a stack of old notebooks covered in dust. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed the top one and flipped it open. The pages were filled with messy, frantic handwriting. Most of it was incoherent rambling about the voices in the walls and keeping it sealed. But one line was repeated over and over, "Don't open the walls." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to think, but the tapping sound the night before suddenly felt a lot more sinister. I slammed the notebook shut and decided I needed to get out of the house for a while. That night, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder than ever tap. Then a pause, then again tap. I tried to ignore it, but it was relentless. I grabbed a broom and started banging on the walls, yelling for it to stop, and then it did. But as soon as the tapping stopped, I heard something else. A voice. Faint, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a wave of terror through me. It said, "Help me." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called a contractor to inspect the walls, hoping there was some logical explanation, maybe a trapped animal or a broken pipe. When the contractor arrived, I explained what had been happening. He gave me a skeptical look, but agreed to take a look. After an hour of work, he called me down to the basement. He had opened one of the walls near the living room and was standing there, pale and shaken. Inside the wall, tucked into a small cavity, was something wrapped in an old, tattered blanket. He unwrapped it, and we both recoiled. It was a bundle of bones, small, human bones. He called the police, who launched an investigation. They told me the remains belonged to a child, likely a young girl, and had been there for decades. They couldn't explain how she had ended up there, or why. The notebooks in the basement were taken as evidence, but they didn't shed much light on what had happened. I moved out of that house as soon as I could. About 4 years ago, my girlfriend and I moved into a rental house on the edge of town. It was a cute little place, old but well kept, with just enough space for the two of us. It had this charming vintage vibe, with creaky hardwood floors and a stone fireplace that we loved right away. It felt like a perfect fresh start. The landlord was an older man, quiet but friendly. He told us the house had been empty for a while and joked that it would be happy to have people living in it again. The only thing that struck me as odd was his parting comment before he handed over the keys. "Make sure you lock the attic door at night." I asked him what he meant, and he waved it off, saying it was just an old house quirk, and that it sometimes made strange noises. I thought he was being overly cautious, but I nodded and thanked him. We settled in quickly, decorating the house and making it our own. For the first week, everything was great. Quiet nights, cozy evenings by the fire, It was exactly what we'd hoped for. But then, one night, we started hearing noises. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., when I woke up to the sound of something faint but persistent. It was a soft thump. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe an animal on the roof, but the sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from above us, the attic. I shook my girlfriend awake, and we both sat there, listening. The sound was rhythmic, like someone was pacing back and forth. I told her it was probably just the house settling. Old houses make noises, after all, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Truth be told, I didn't believe myself either. The next morning, I decided to check the attic, just to put our minds at ease. The door to the attic was at the end of the upstairs hallway, an old wooden hatch with a flimsy lock. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed up the narrow, rickety stairs. The attic was mostly empty, just a few boxes left behind by previous tenants. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the only light came from a single dirty window at the far end. There was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints, no animals, nothing. I came back down and reassured my girlfriend that it was all in our heads, but that night, the noises started again. This time it wasn't just the pacing. We heard a dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor above us. I tried to ignore it, but my girlfriend was getting increasingly scared. She insisted we lock the attic door, just like the landlord had told us to. Reluctantly, I grabbed the tiny key that had come with the house and locked the hatch. I felt ridiculous doing it, but if it helped her sleep, I was willing to humor her. That was the first night the noises stopped. For the next few days, the house was eerily quiet, no thumps, no dragging sounds, nothing. But then, one morning, I woke up to find the attic door unlocked and slightly ajar. I knew I'd locked it the night before. I double-checked it every night after the noises had started. I stood there staring at the door, my heart pounding. My girlfriend was still asleep, so I quietly climbed back into the attic, flashlight in hand. This time, things were different. One of the boxes that had been shoved into a corner was now sitting in the middle of the room. The lid was off, and inside were dozens of photographs. They were old black and white pictures, all of them of the same family. A man, a woman, and 2 little girls. The weird thing was, in every single photo, the family looked wrong. In the first few pictures, they were smiling, but their expressions were stiff and forced, like they didn't want to be there. As I flipped through the stack, the smiles disappeared altogether. In the later photos, their faces were blank, their eyes staring directly at the camera. And then toward the bottom of the stack, the family wasn't in the pictures anymore. Instead, the photos showed the attic, empty, just like it was now, except for one detail. In the corner of every picture, there was a shadow, faint but unmistakable, like someone was standing just out of frame. I dropped the photos and ran back downstairs, slamming the attic door shut. I didn't tell my girlfriend what I'd found, but I insisted we call the landlord. When I explained what had been happening, he got quiet. After a long pause, he said, "It's probably time I told you the truth about that house." He told me that decades ago, a family had lived there. They had a young daughter who was different. He didn't go into detail, but he said she used to spend hours in the attic talking to someone who wasn't there. One day, the family just disappeared. No one ever figured out what happened to them. The landlord swore he'd never experienced anything strange in the house himself, but his previous tenants had complained about the attic too. He thought locking the door might help, but it clearly hadn't. We moved out a week later. I never went back into that attic. I had just gotten home from a late shift and wanted nothing more than to crash on the couch. It was almost midnight and the streets outside were eerily quiet. My house sits at the edge of a wooded area, so nights can get pretty dark and unsettling, especially when it's windy. That night, the wind was strong and the trees groaned with each gust. After locking the door, I grabbed a snack from the kitchen and sank into the couch. I had barely started scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint knock. Not on the front door, but from the back of the house. I froze, my hand hovering over the screen. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft knocks. My first thought was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the siding. But the sound was deliberate, rhythmic. I stood up, creeping toward the back door. The hallway leading there was pitch black and my heart was already racing. When I reached the door, I flicked on the porch light. The bulb buzzed to life, casting a dim glow across the small porch. No one was there, just the empty yard and the swaying trees beyond. I told myself it was nothing and went back to the couch, trying to shake off the unease. A few minutes passed, and I heard it again. This time it wasn't a knock. It was a scraping sound, like something sharp dragging against wood. It was coming from the side window in the living room. I whipped my head toward the sound, my stomach knotting. Slowly, I got up and approached the window, my phone flashlight trembling in my hand. I peeled back the curtain just enough to peek outside, nothing. The yard was empty, the trees bending in the wind. I closed the curtain and tried to laugh it off, but my pulse was still racing. I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, then went to my bedroom. As I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I left the hallway light on and tried to fall asleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, knocking. This time it was louder. It was coming from my bedroom window. I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, followed by a soft scrape, like fingernails against glass. I didn't want to look. I didn't even want to breathe, but I had to. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtain was drawn, but in the faint light from the hallway, I saw something behind it, a silhouette. It was tall, impossibly thin, and standing unnaturally still. I couldn't move. My entire body felt paralyzed with fear. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the figure shifted slightly. I heard the faintest sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, and way too close. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. Grabbing my phone, I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I ran out of the house, not even bothering to put on shoes, and got into my car. I called the police from down the street. When they arrived, they found no one inside the house. But outside, beneath my bedroom window, they discovered something chilling. A set of long, deep scratches carved into the wood, as if someone or something had been clawing to get in. I never stayed another night in that house. To this day, I can't shake the image of that shadow behind the curtain. Last summer, I rented a small cottage in the woods for a week to get away from the stress of work. It was one of those cozy, rustic places you see in travel brochures. A little outdated, but charming. The listing said it was off the grid, with no Wi-Fi or TV, but that was exactly what I wanted. Just peace, quiet, and a chance to unplug. The cottage sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by thick trees. The nearest town was about a 20-minute drive away, and the closest neighbor was even farther. When I arrived, the owner handed me the keys and gave me a quick tour, pointing out a few quirks, like the temperamental plumbing and the slightly sticky front door. As he was leaving, he casually mentioned, "Oh, and if you hear anything at night, it's probably just animals. These woods are full of them." I didn't think much of it at the time. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner, read for a while, and went to bed early. The quiet was almost unnerving, but I quickly got used to it. On the second night, I was sitting on the porch, sipping tea and enjoying the cool evening air, when I heard something. It was faint at first, like a low hum or a distant whistle. I assumed it was the wind, but then it grew louder, closer. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like singing. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't a melody I recognized, and the voice, if it was a voice, sounded warped, almost mechanical. I stood up and peered into the trees, but the forest was too dark to see anything. After a few minutes, the sound faded away, leaving me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe someone was camping nearby, or maybe I was just imagining things. The third night was when things got worse. I was in bed, just starting to drift off when I heard it again. The singing. This time it was louder and more distinct, like it was coming from right outside the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice wasn't melodic, it was more like a chant repeating the same eerie, indecipherable words over and over. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. There was no one there, but the singing didn't stop. It seemed to be moving, circling the house. I stayed perfectly still, clutching my phone, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the sound grew fainter and disappeared into the woods. The next morning, I considered leaving, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just a prank or some strange acoustics carrying sound from somewhere else. I decided to stick it out for the rest of the week. That night, I regretted my decision. I was brushing my teeth in the tiny bathroom when I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I froze, staring at the closed bathroom door. The steps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. 3 slow, even knocks on the front door. I crept out of the bathroom and peeked through the window, but I couldn't see anyone. I debated what to do. Should I call the owner of the police or just wait it out? My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call anyone even if I wanted to. The knocking came again, this time louder. I grabbed a kitchen knife and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I mustered up what little courage I had and approached the door. My hands were trembling as I unlocked it and flung it open, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. No one was there. But on the porch, right in front of the door, was something that hadn't been there before, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I hesitated before picking it up. The cloth was damp and smelled faintly of earth. Inside was a crude doll made of twigs and string, its head shaped like a distorted face, with hollow eyes. I threw it off the porch and slammed the door shut, locking it and shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. That night I barely slept. The singing didn't return, and neither did the footsteps, but I kept hearing faint rustling outside, like someone or something was watching the house. At sunrise, I packed my bags and left. I didn't even bother cleaning up or letting the owner know I was leaving early. To this day, I don't know what happened in those woods or who left that doll on my porch. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear it again. That strange, haunting melody, faint and distant, like it's still searching for me. It was mid-January, bitterly cold, and I was working the graveyard shift at a highway rest stop convenience store. The place was out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods. On a clear day, the scenery was picturesque. On a cold, dark night like that one, it was downright unsettling. The snowstorm had started just after 10 p.m., and by midnight, the parking lot was a sheet of ice. I hadn't seen a customer in over an hour, so I busied myself stocking shelves and cleaning up. The only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the occasional creak of the old building settling in the cold. Around 12:30 a.m., I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the icy lot. I froze, listening, as the sound grew closer. A man appeared out of the storm, his figure barely visible through the frost-covered windows. He was tall and wearing an old ragged coat, the kind you'd expect to see in a thrift shop. The automatic door slid open and he stepped inside, snow trailing in after him. He didn't say a word, just stood there for a moment, shivering. "Cold out there, huh?" I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond. His face was pale and his eyes were wide, like he'd just seen something terrible. I asked if he needed help, but he just shook his head and walked to the far corner of the store, where the coffee machine was. I watched him carefully as he poured himself a cup of coffee. His hands were trembling so much that half the coffee spilled onto the counter. He didn't seem to care. He just stood there, staring into the cup like he was trying to warm himself at the sight of it. A few minutes passed, and I was about to go back to restocking when the door slid open again. I looked up, expecting another customer, but no one was there. The man turned his head sharply toward the door, his eyes darting back and forth. "You locked the back door, right?" he asked suddenly, his voice low and hoarse. What I replied, confused. "The back door," he repeated. "You locked it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "There's no back door, just the emergency exit," I said. The man's face turned ashen. "Then it's too late," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, the lights flickered. The building groaned as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The man backed into the corner, clutching the coffee cup like it was a lifeline. "What's too late?" I demanded, my voice rising. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the back of the store, where the emergency exit was. My stomach tightened as I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the door. "Don't open it," he said urgently. "Whatever you do, don't open it." I stared at him, unsure if this was some kind of prank or if he was genuinely terrified. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it turned into pounding. My instincts told me to grab the phone and call the police, but before I could, the pounding stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard the soft creak of the emergency exit door opening. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a metal broom handle, and slowly made my way toward the back. The man stayed where he was, muttering something under his breath. When I reached the emergency exit, the door was ajar, letting in a freezing gust of wind. Snow swirled into the room, but there were no footprints outside, just an empty stretch of snow-covered ground. I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. As I turned back toward the front of the store, I realized the man was gone. His coffee cup sat abandoned on the counter, still steaming. I never saw him again, and I don't know what happened that night. The security footage from that shift was corrupted, static, filled the screen for most of the night with only brief, blurry glimpses of me and the man. But every now and then, when I work a late shift, I hear it again, the tapping at the back door. My girlfriend Emily and I recently moved into an old Victorian house in a small New England town. We'd been together for years and were ready to leave the city behind, dreaming of quiet mornings and cozy evenings by the fireplace. The house was everything we wanted: big windows, creaky wooden floors, and a wraparound porch. The only downside was its age, which meant constant upkeep. From the moment we moved in, though, something felt off. It started with small things: a cabinet door left open when I was sure I'd closed it, the sound of footsteps upstairs when Emily and I were both downstairs. We chalked it up to the house settling, or our imaginations. After all, old houses make noises, right? Then the whispers began. At first I only heard them late at night. I'd wake up and think Emily was talking in her sleep, but when I rolled over, she'd be out cold. The whispers were faint, unintelligible, and seemed to come from the walls themselves. One night I mentioned it to Emily, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, her face went pale. She admitted she'd heard them too, soft murmurs she couldn't quite make out. We decided to do a thorough inspection of the house, thinking maybe there were drafts or pests causing the sounds. In the basement, we found an old fuse box, a pile of rotted wood, and a boarded-up door we hadn't noticed before. It was small, barely tall enough for a person to crawl through. Probably just an old coal chute or something, Emily said, though she didn't sound convinced. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound, like a faint scraping coming from below us. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs. The noise led me back to the basement. The boards over the small door had been pried loose. Emily swore she hadn't touched it, and neither had I. We stared at the now exposed opening, which was pitch black inside. Against my better judgment, I shined my flashlight into the space. It was a narrow passage that stretched into the darkness. The walls were made of crumbling stone, and the dirt floor was littered with small bones. Maybe from animals, but I wasn't sure. We called a local handyman the next day to seal it up again. He laughed at us, saying old houses always had quirks, but he nailed the boards back into place. For a while things were quiet, but about a week later, the scratching returned, this time louder and more insistent. Emily refused to go into the basement after that, and I didn't blame her. Then, 2 nights ago, everything escalated. I woke up to the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the basement. Not whispers, not scratching. Footsteps. I grabbed a bat from the closet and headed downstairs, heart pounding. Emily begged me not to go, but I couldn't just stay in bed. The basement door was wide open. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, the boards over the small door were gone. Not just loose this time, gone. The opening was pitch black, but I swear, I could feel something standing just beyond the edge of the light from my flashlight, watching me. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then from the darkness I heard a whisper, clear and deliberate this time. "Get out." I bolted upstairs, slammed the basement door shut, and shoved a heavy bookshelf in front of it. Emily was already packing our bags. We left that night and checked into a motel. I don't know who or what is in that house, but we're not going back. Tomorrow I'm calling a realtor to put it on the market. I don't care how much money we lose. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. A year ago, I moved into a modest 2-bedroom house in a quiet rural area. The rent was cheap, the neighbors were far enough away to offer privacy, and the surrounding woods were peaceful. For someone like me, introverted and tired of city life, it seemed perfect. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my evenings unpacking, reading, or going for walks on the trails nearby. The house had its quirks: creaky floorboards, doors that didn't quite shut properly, and an old basement I avoided simply because it gave me the creeps. It wasn't dirty or anything, just wrong. The basement door was in the kitchen, and it had a small, rusty lock that didn't actually work. Whenever I passed by it, I felt uneasy, like someone was standing just on the other side. I chalked it up to paranoia and ignored it. One night, about a month after I moved in, I was in bed reading when I heard something strange, a faint but distinct noise, like a scraping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. Maybe an animal against the house or a branch brushing the siding. But when I turned off my lamp and listened, I realized it was coming from inside. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I froze, straining to hear. The scraping stopped for a moment, then started again, slow, deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. My heart pounded as I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe something had fallen over, I thought, or maybe it really was an animal that had somehow gotten inside. Grabbing a flashlight, I worked up the courage to check it out. The basement door creaked loudly as I opened it, and I felt a rush of cold, stale air hit me. My flashlight beam trembled as I descended the old wooden stairs. The basement was mostly empty, save for a few shelves covered in dust and a single chair sitting in the middle of the room. There was nothing else there. No sign of movement, no tracks, nothing that could explain the noise. Feeling more unnerved than reassured, I went back upstairs and shut the door. That night, I barely slept. The next few days were quiet, and I started to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But a week later, it happened again. Only this time, it was worse. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, when I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the basement, slow, deliberate, one step at a time. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink. The footsteps stopped just beneath the basement door. Then there was a knock. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks on the inside of the door. My blood ran cold. I wanted to run, to call someone, to do anything, but I couldn't move. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone down there? Had they been hiding there the whole time? How had they gotten in? Finally, I mustered the courage to speak. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed a kitchen knife and backed away, keeping my eyes on the door. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the knife. After a few minutes of silence, I forced myself to open the door. The stairs leading down to the basement were empty. But there, on the top step, was something that hadn't been there before, a small wooden figurine. It was crudely carved, resembling a person with long, thin limbs and no face. I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though I knew the lock was useless. The next day, I called the landlord. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. But I asked if there was any history to the house, or if anyone else had ever mentioned strange noises. He paused before answering. "The house used to belong to a man named Walter," he said. "He lived alone for years, but he wasn't all there, if you know what I mean. Kept to himself, carved those little figurines in his spare time. When he passed, no one claimed the house, so it sat empty for a long time." "What happened to him?" I asked. The landlord hesitated again. "He died in the basement. Heart attack, I think." That was all I needed to hear. I moved out the following week. I don't know who or what left that figurine on the stairs, but I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps or the knock at the door. And sometimes when I lie awake at night in my new apartment, I wonder, if I'd gone down there that night, would I have found Walter or something else entirely? It was one of those late summer nights when the heat refuses to leave, even after dark. I was working the night shift at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Not many people came through at this hour, but there was always the occasional trucker or traveler passing through. Around 1 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, and a man stepped in. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket despite the oppressive heat, and his face was partially obscured by a baseball cap. He glanced around before sitting at the counter, his back to the door. I was cleaning the counter when he finally spoke up, his voice low but clear. "Black coffee," he said. I nodded and got to work, trying not to stare. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I made his coffee, and when I set it down in front of him, he didn't look up. He just kept staring straight ahead, his fingers gripping the mug a little too tightly. I tried to go back to my cleaning, but it felt like there was a weight in the air, like someone was watching me. I glanced up at him and saw that he was still staring straight ahead. It was almost as if he wasn't aware of anything around him. The bell over the door jingled again, and I turned to see another man walking in. He was shorter, with unkempt hair and a tired expression. He didn't even acknowledge me as he sat down a few stools away from the first man. It was then that I noticed something strange. The first man's posture was rigid, unnaturally so. His back was straight, but his hands were shaking slightly, almost imperceptibly. The second man ordered a coffee as well, and I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. I couldn't pinpoint it, but the whole scene had this eerie, unsettling vibe to it. The second man's coffee came, but as I turned to walk back to the counter, I caught a glimpse of the first man's reflection in the window. His eyes were wide, but they weren't looking at anything in particular. It was as though he was seeing something else, something only he could see. I froze, my heart pounded. The second man, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, suddenly glanced over at the first man. His eyes locked on him for a brief second. Then he turned his gaze back to the counter, never acknowledging that anything had happened. I couldn't stand it anymore. "Is everything okay?" I asked the first man, my voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes snapped to mine, and for the briefest moment there was something unsettling in his gaze. Something deep, something hollow. "Fine," he muttered. His voice was strangely distant, as if he wasn't really talking to me. "Everything's fine." I took a step back, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. A few minutes passed, and the diner was oddly quiet. The second man finished his coffee and stood up, leaving some change on the counter. He didn't look at either of us as he walked out into the night, leaving the door to jingle behind him. But the first man didn't move. He sat there, staring ahead, unmoving. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow waiting for something, or someone. I went back to cleaning, but every few seconds, I glanced over at him. His hands were still trembling, his eyes still unfocused. Then, the strangest thing happened. The door jingled again. I looked up, expecting another customer, but the bell had rung too quickly, too suddenly. There was no one standing there. The first man stood up then, but not like someone who had just decided to leave. He moved slowly, stiffly, like he was trying to rise from some kind of paralysis. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his movements were jerky, unnatural. I watched, frozen, as he walked toward the door. It was as if he was being pulled by something invisible. When he reached the door, he stopped. He turned around to face me, and for a brief second I could swear I saw his mouth twitch in a grim smile. Then he left. I didn't move. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of something scraping against the pavement outside. I hesitated, then peeked through the window. There was nothing there. I didn't work the night shift much after that. And to this day, I still wonder what happened that night, who the man was, and why I never saw him again. When we moved to the old farmhouse on the edge of town, my wife Rachel and I had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. The house was large, too large for just the two of us, but it was affordable, and the land surrounding it was beautiful. It had been sitting empty for years. Abandoned after the last owner, an elderly man named Mr. Collins, passed away. The realtor said it had been on the market for months and just needed a little work, so we jumped at the opportunity. The first few weeks were idyllic. We spent the days exploring the property, working on repairs, and adjusting to country life. There was a large barn in the back that we never paid much attention to at first, and a small pond on the far side of the property, where we occasionally saw deer grazing in the mornings. But then Rachel began to notice strange things. It started with little noises. At night, when we were in bed, she would hear soft footsteps above us, like someone walking in the attic. I told her it was just the house settling. It was old after all. But the noises continued, footsteps, dragging sounds, like someone shuffling around in the darkness. I didn't want to worry her, but eventually I started hearing it too. One night Rachel had trouble sleeping. I woke up to find her sitting up in bed, staring at the ceiling. "I keep hearing it," she whispered. "Hearing what?" "The footsteps." She paused. "They're up there." I got up and checked the attic, but there was nothing, just dust, old furniture, and cobwebs. The sounds had stopped for the time being, so I chalked it up to old house noises again. The real trouble began when Rachel discovered the door in the basement. One afternoon, while I was working on the garden, she went down to the basement to find something. She came up a few minutes later, pale and shaken. "There's something down there," she said, her voice shaking. I followed her down, thinking it was just another one of her overactive imaginations. But when we reached the basement, I saw what she was talking about. At the far end of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a door. It was a small wooden door, almost hidden from view. The wood was old and the handle was rusted, but there was no lock on it. "I've never seen this before," Rachel said, her voice trembling. I tried the handle. It was stuck. I gave it a hard push, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was dark, filled with thick, stale air. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to peer inside. There was a staircase. It led down into what looked like a cellar. We didn't go down right away. I was hesitant, unsure of what we might find. But curiosity got the best of me, and I convinced Rachel to come with me. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and made our way down. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the cold, dark space. At the bottom of the stairs, there was another door. This one was made of metal, heavier, almost industrial, and it was locked. "What do you think is behind it?" Rachel whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. "I don't know," I said, but I felt uneasy. There was something about this door that felt wrong. We left it alone for a few days, but the noises upstairs started again, the footsteps in the attic getting louder each night, and every time we went to the basement, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the other side of that locked door. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to do something about it. I borrowed a crowbar from a neighbor and pried the door open. It took some effort, but eventually, the door cracked open, revealing a dark hallway. I stepped inside, and the air was thick and damp. The sound of my boots echoed against the walls. At the end of the hall, there was a small room, its door slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was filled with old furniture, chairs, tables, bookshelves. But what caught my eye was the far wall. It was covered in old photographs, yellowed with age. But these weren't just ordinary family photos or landscapes. These pictures were wrong. In every one of them, there was a figure standing in the background, a shadowy, indistinct shape, barely visible, but it was always there. I turned to leave, but then I saw something else, a small tattered journal on the floor. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with strange, cryptic writing, passages about watching, waiting, and never leaving. I didn't read much more. I slammed the journal shut and ran back upstairs, but when I reached the top of the basement stairs, I realized something was wrong. Rachel was gone. I searched the house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. I checked the barn, the pond, every room in the house. Nothing. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and ran upstairs, my heart pounding. I reached the attic door and opened it, but when I looked inside, I froze. The attic was empty, except for Rachel. She was sitting in the corner, her back to me, staring at the wall. "Rachel," I called. She didn't move. I walked over to her and gently touched her shoulder. She flinched and looked up at me, her eyes wide, hollow. "They're here," she whispered. "They're waiting." That's when I realized the house wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting for us. It was late November, and I was working the night shift at a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The place was always dead at night, just a few truckers passing through, maybe a couple of people staying for a night or two, but on this particular night, things felt different. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old building creak. The rain had started around midnight, pouring down in sheets. I'd been working alone for a few hours, but as the clock struck 2 a.m. I felt like I was being watched. There had been no one in the lobby for hours, and the silence was almost unbearable. Just as I was starting to think I might be imagining things, the door swung open with a soft chime. A man stepped inside, drenched from the rain. He was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the hood. He was wet and shivering, his clothes sticking to his skin. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my heart was beating faster. The man didn't answer right away. He just stood there looking around the lobby. His eyes seemed empty, distant, like he wasn't seeing anything at all. I repeated the question, and finally he looked at me. "A room." "I need a room," he said, his voice low and raspy. I gave him a key to one of the empty rooms, and he took it without another word, disappearing down the hallway. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. About an hour later, I was cleaning up behind the counter when I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps coming down the hall. I glanced up, expecting to see the man, but no one appeared. The footsteps continued, growing louder until they were right outside the lobby. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up quickly, scanning the hallway through the small window in the door. But there was no one there. The footsteps stopped. There was a brief moment of silence, and then the door to the office slowly creaked open. The man stood in the doorway, staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "I can't stay here," he said, his voice shaking now. "I need to leave." "Why, what's wrong?" I asked, feeling my skin crawl. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, his gaze darting nervously. Then he stepped closer to the counter, and in a hushed voice, he said, "It's in the room with me. It's been watching me." I froze, unsure of how to react. "What do you mean, who's watching me?" He shook his head frantically, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I don't know, I just know it's there. I can feel it. It's been watching me ever since I walked in. The air in the lobby seemed to grow colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a strange sense of dread wash over me, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Okay," I said slowly, "maybe you should just sit down for a minute. Let's talk about it." Before I could say anything else, the man bolted for the door. I stood frozen for a second, but then instinct kicked in and I rushed to the window to watch him leave. He was running toward the parking lot, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. But just as he reached the door, I noticed something strange. A shadow appeared behind him, moving unnaturally fast, darting from one side of the parking lot to the other. It didn't look like a person. It was too fast, too fluid. I watched as the man reached his car, but before he could open the door, the shadow lunged at him. He screamed, a high-pitched, frantic scream that cut through the night like a knife. The next few moments were a blur. He was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign of the shadow that had followed him. The parking lot was empty, silent once more. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I couldn't stay in that motel another minute. I called the police, but when they arrived, there was no evidence of the man ever having been there. The only thing they found was a single muddy footprint leading from the parking lot to the road. It stopped abruptly, as though the person who had made it had simply vanished into thin air. I don't know what happened that night, or who, or what that man had been running from, but I've never worked another night shift there since. And sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I hear footsteps behind me. I don't turn around. I had just moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a small yard, but it was quiet and affordable. The landlord mentioned that the previous tenant left in a hurry, but I didn't think much of it. My first night there, I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I heard it. A faint thumping sound coming from the ceiling. I paused, listening carefully. It wasn't constant, just a few slow, deliberate thumps, like something heavy shifting in the attic. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bird, and decided to check it out in the morning. The next day I found the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. It had one of those pull-down ladders, and I had to use a broom handle to knock it open. Dust rained down as the ladder unfolded, and a rush of cold, stale air hit me. Climbing up, I peered into the dim space, using my phone flashlight to look around. The attic was empty, no signs of animals, no nests, nothing. But then I noticed something strange. In the middle of the attic floor was a single chair, old, wooden, and covered in dust. It was facing one corner of the attic, where the wall was scrawled with scratches as if something or someone had been clawing at it. Uneasy, I climbed back down and shut the hatch, trying to put it out of my mind. That night, the thumping came back. It was louder this time, echoing through the house. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. Then I heard something new. Soft, shuffling footsteps, moving across the attic. I grabbed my phone and texted the landlord, asking if anyone else had keys to the house. He replied almost immediately, saying no one did. I couldn't sleep after that. Around 3 a.m., I finally worked up the nerve to check the attic again. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy wrench, telling myself it was probably nothing, just an animal or loose boards. When I pulled the hatch open, the ladder unfolded on its own, creaking as it hit the floor. I shined the flashlight up into the attic. The chair was no longer in the middle of the floor. It was now facing the hatch directly at me. My stomach dropped and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. There was no one there, but I could feel something, like I was being watched. I slammed the hatch shut and locked myself in my room, sitting on the bed with my back against the wall. The next morning I called the landlord and told him I couldn't stay there anymore. He didn't seem surprised. When I pressed him, he finally admitted that the last tenant had left without notice, complaining about strange noises and furniture moving on its own. I moved out that same day, but every now and then, when I close my eyes, I see that chair, and I can't help but wonder who was sitting in it. It was supposed to be a relaxing evening. I had the house to myself for the weekend, so I planned to watch some movies, order takeout, and unwind. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, a light drizzle pattered against the windows, and the wind occasionally howled. I was halfway through a horror movie when I heard something faint, like a thud, It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me pause the movie. The sound seemed to come from upstairs. I sat there for a moment, straining to hear, but there was nothing else. Probably just the house settling, I muttered to myself, trying to sound convincing. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was more distinct, a soft, muffled noise, like footsteps on carpet. I froze, my eyes darting toward the ceiling. I lived alone. No one else should have been in the house. Grabbing my phone, I stood and walked to the bottom of the staircase. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Silence. I debated going up there, but decided to check the front and back doors first. Both were locked, just as I had left them. Feeling a little braver, I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way upstairs. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the bathroom nightlight. My heart pounded as I checked each room, opening closets and peeking under beds. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining things and headed back downstairs, but as I reached the bottom step, I heard something behind me. A faint creak. I spun around, shining the flashlight up the stairs. At first I saw nothing, then at the very top I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow. It darted out of sight before I could get a good look. My blood ran cold and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and locked myself in the pantry. My hands shook as I dialed 911, whispering to the operator about what I had seen. As I waited for the police to arrive, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending the stairs. They stopped right outside the pantry door. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The doorknob rattled, but the door didn't open. Then, silence. When the police arrived, they found the front door wide open. They searched the house but found no one. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. The scariest part. When they reviewed the security footage from my front door camera, they saw something or someone entering the house. A tall figure in dark clothing, face obscured by a hood, but there was no footage of them leaving. Ethan and I had been married for 6 years when we finally bought our first house. It wasn't much, just a small 2-bedroom place on the outskirts of a sleepy Midwestern town, but it was ours, and that was enough. The house had been sitting vacant for years before we moved in. The realtor said the previous owners left town in a hurry, but she didn't give many details, and we didn't press her. We were just happy to have found something affordable. The first few weeks were blissful. Ethan and I spent our evenings painting walls, unpacking boxes, and dreaming about what we'd do with the extra bedroom someday. But as we settled in, we started noticing strange things. It began with the smell. Every now and then, we'd catch this faint, acrid odor, like burning hair or plastic. It was fleeting, here one moment and gone the next, and we couldn't figure out where it was coming from. We checked the wiring, the vents, even the crawl space under the house. Nothing. Then about a month after moving in, I found something unusual in the attic. I was up there looking for a box of winter clothes when I noticed a small, locked chest shoved into a corner. It was old, made of dark wood with tarnished metal hinges, and covered in a thin layer of dust. I called Ethan to come take a look, and together we decided to open it. Inside, we found a pile of yellowed newspaper clippings, all about the same person, a man named Walter Green. At first, the article seemed pretty ordinary. He was a school teacher in the 1970s, well liked by his students. But as we read on, the tone of the articles changed. Walter had gone missing one night without a trace. The last article in the pile mentioned that his disappearance had never been solved. The strangest part, his address matched ours. Ethan tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just some old town mystery, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. That night, I dreamed about Walter. A tall man with piercing eyes and a worn-out suit standing at the foot of our bed, staring silently at me. I woke up covered in sweat, but when I turned to tell Ethan about it, he was already sitting up, pale-faced. "I heard something," he whispered. We both stayed still, straining to listen. After a moment, I heard it too, a soft shuffling sound coming from somewhere inside the house. "It's probably just the pipes," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. But then we heard a creak, loud and deliberate, like someone stepping on the old wooden stairs leading to the attic. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and insisted on checking it out. I followed close behind, holding a heavy wrench I'd grabbed from the kitchen drawer. When we opened the attic door, the smell hit us immediately, that same acrid, burning odor. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. We climbed up slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At first, we didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed something strange. The chest, the one we'd opened earlier, was gone. "Did you move it?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, too afraid to speak. Then from the far end of the attic, we heard a noise. It was faint, almost like a sigh, but it sent chills down my spine. Ethan pointed the flashlight toward the sound, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the beam. That was enough for me. I grabbed Ethan's arm and practically dragged him back downstairs. We locked the attic door and piled furniture in front of it, as if that would help. Neither of us slept that night. The next day, Ethan tried to convince me it was just our imagination, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We agreed to call a locksmith to install better locks, and maybe even a security system. But last night, things got worse. I woke up to the sound of humming, a soft, tuneless melody coming from somewhere in the house. Ethan was already awake, staring at the bedroom door. "It's coming from the basement," he whispered. We hadn't spent much time down there since moving in. It was dark, damp, and smelled like mildew, hardly a welcoming space. But now the humming was echoing up the stairs, faint but persistent. Ethan grabbed the flashlight again, and I followed him, heart pounding. When we reached the basement, the humming stopped. The only sound was the dripping of a leaky pipe. We looked around, but nothing seemed out of place until I saw it. In the center of the basement floor was the chest, the same one we'd found in the attic. It was sitting there, closed and locked as if it had been waiting for us. I don't know what's going on in this house, but I do know one thing: we're leaving. Tomorrow we're packing up and getting as far away from here as possible. I don't care what it costs us to break the lease. Whatever happened to Walter Green, I think it's still here, and it doesn't want us to leave. I was house-sitting for a friend who lived out in the countryside. It wasn't exactly my idea of fun, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by endless fields, but the pay was good, and I needed the money. The first couple of nights were uneventful, just me and the dog, Max. On the third night, though, something felt off. The air outside was still, no wind, no insects chirping, just silence. I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place and focused on my book, trying to ignore the unease creeping in. Around 10 p.m., I heard something strange, a soft tapping coming from one of the windows in the living room. Max's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl, staring intently toward the back of the house. I got up and walked to the window. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, light and rhythmic. My heart was pounding as I pulled the curtain back, half expecting to see a tree branch or something brushing against the glass. There was nothing there. The backyard was empty, lit faintly by the moon. I shook my head, muttering to myself about how I was being paranoid, and went back to the couch. Max, though, wouldn't settle. He kept growling, his gaze fixed on the hallway leading to the bedrooms. "Max, knock it off," I said, trying to sound calm. But then I heard it again, the tapping, only now it wasn't at the window, it was at the back door. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Max started barking, a deep, guttural sound that made me even more uneasy. Slowly, I walked to the back door, gripping the flashlight I'd brought with me. The door was locked, but I could see faint smudges on the glass, like fingerprints or something else. I shone the flashlight outside, scanning the yard. At first, I saw nothing, but then at the edge of the light's reach, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, barely visible, standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, unnaturally so, and still. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague outline of a person, or something shaped like one. My breath hitched, and I quickly locked the deadbolt, retreating back into the living room. Max was pacing now, barking furiously at the back door. Then the sound changed. The tapping stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails dragging across the doorframe. My mind raced. I didn't have a weapon, just the flashlight in my phone. I dialed 911, whispering into the phone as I tried to explain what was happening. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but the nearest station was 20 minutes out. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I stood frozen, my back against the wall, flashlight shaking in my hand. Max stopped barking and let out a whimper. backing up until he was pressed against my legs. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, moving around the house. Whoever or whatever it was circled the house twice before stopping again at the back door. This time, there was no tapping, no scraping, just a single loud knock. Bang. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. When the police finally arrived, they found no one. The officers checked the property and surrounding area, but came up empty. Still, they stayed with me while I packed up my things and left. The next day, my friend called, thanking me for watching the house and asking how everything went. I hesitated, but eventually told her about the night before. She was quiet for a moment before saying, "That's strange. The last person who house sat for me said they heard the same thing, knocking, footsteps. But I thought they were just trying to scare me. I haven't gone back to that house since, and I don't think I ever will." When my husband Greg and I found the cabin, it felt like fate. We'd been looking for a quiet getaway, a place to escape from the chaos of city life. The cabin sat at the edge of a sprawling forest, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but trees and sky surrounding it. It wasn't in perfect shape, peeling paint, overgrown yard, but that only made it more charming to us. We moved in late last fall. The first few weeks were peaceful, almost magical. The air was crisp, the leaves were golden, and at night, the stars stretched endlessly above us. We'd sit by the fireplace listening to the crackle of the logs and talk about how lucky we were. But then the noises started. The first time I heard it, I was alone. Greg had gone into town for supplies, and I was curled up on the couch reading a book. At first it sounded like a branch tapping against a window. I ignored it, but it didn't stop. Tap. I finally set my book down and went to check. The wind was calm, and there were no branches near the window. I told myself it must have been an animal, and went back to the couch. The next night, Greg heard it too. We were in bed, just starting to drift off, when the sound began again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Tapped. "It's just the wind," Greg mumbled, but I could tell he didn't believe it. The tapping continued for several nights. It moved from window to window, always just loud enough to wake us, but never consistent enough for us to catch the culprit. Greg set up a motion-activated camera outside, hoping to figure out what it was. The next morning, he checked the footage. The camera had recorded the sound, but the strange thing was, there was nothing there. The yard was empty. That's when we started finding the marks. At first, it was just small scratches on the wood around the windows. But over the next few days, they grew longer, deeper. One morning, I noticed what looked like handprints smudged on the glass. Small, pale prints like a child's. "We should call someone," I told Greg, but he shook his head. "It's probably just some animal." "Raccoons or something?" I wasn't convinced. A week later, I woke up to find Greg sitting at the kitchen table, pale and wide-eyed. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I saw it," he whispered. He told me he'd been unable to sleep and had gone outside to check the yard. That's when he saw something moving near the edge of the woods. At first, he thought it was an animal, but as it moved closer, he realized it was standing upright. It was small, he said. Too small to be an adult, but it didn't look like a kid either. It was wrong. I pressed him for details, but he just shook his head, like he didn't want to remember. After that, Greg refused to go outside after dark. He started locking every door and window before sunset, triple-checking them like his life depended on it. One night, we were jolted awake by a loud crash. It sounded like something had hit the side of the cabin. Greg grabbed a flashlight and headed outside while I stayed inside, clutching my phone, ready to call for help. When he came back, he was shaking. "There's nothing out there," he said. "But the marks, they're everywhere." The next morning, I saw what he meant. Deep gouges covered the cabin walls as if something with claws had raked them over and over again. That was when we decided to leave. We packed our things as quickly as we could and headed back to the city. We didn't even bother trying to sell the cabin. We just wanted to forget it ever existed. But here's the thing. It followed us. Last night in our apartment, I heard the tapping. When I looked out the window, I saw the smudged handprints. This time they were on the inside. My name is Mark, and I've never been superstitious. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything of the sort. I've always thought of myself as a rational person, someone who relies on logic and facts. So when my wife, Jessica, and I bought an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, I never expected the strange things that would unfold. We were looking for a fresh start, The city life had become too stressful, and we both dreamed of living somewhere quiet with some space to ourselves. The farmhouse we bought was in a remote area far from the nearest town. It was a large, two-story house with a big front porch, nestled in a patch of woods. The kind of house that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale, minus the sense of magic. The house was a steal, way cheaper than it should have been for its size. The realtor claimed it had been on the market for a while, but no one had shown much interest. That didn't raise any red flags for us, though. We loved it from the moment we saw it. It was the perfect place to settle down, away from the noise of the world. The first few weeks were peaceful. We spent our days unpacking, getting used to the layout, and fixing up a few things. The house had been empty for a long time, and there were signs of neglect, cracked windows, dusty floors, and a broken-down barn in the back. But overall, it was in good shape, and we were happy. Then came the dreams. It started with Jessica. She woke up one morning, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "I had the strangest dream," she said. "There was a woman in the house. She was watching us. I brushed it off. It was just a dream, Jess. You've been working a lot. It's probably stress." But over the next few days, Jessica's dreams grew more vivid. She would wake up, drenched in sweat, talking about the woman. She described her as tall and thin, with long black hair and hollow eyes. A woman who seemed to be always watching, always lurking just beyond the shadows. "I know this sounds crazy," she admitted one night, "but I feel like she's here, watching us." I tried to reassure her. "It was just the house," I said. "It was an old place, full of creaks and groans. Maybe the isolation was starting to get to her." But I was wrong. One evening, while I was working late in the study, I heard Jessica scream from upstairs. I rushed to her side, heart racing, and found her standing in the hallway, shaking uncontrollably. "Jess," "What happened?" I asked, trying to calm her down. "I saw her," she whispered. "She was standing at the end of the hall, watching me. I saw her eyes, Mark. They were hollow, empty. She was just standing there, not moving. I didn't know what to think." Jessica was terrified, and I could see the genuine fear in her eyes. But I also couldn't dismiss the possibility that it was all in her head. The house was old, and old houses often play tricks on people's minds. Maybe it was just the dark and the silence getting to her. But then, I started to experience it too. One night, while I was in bed, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was Jessica, maybe going to the bathroom. But when I called her name, there was no answer. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking around, just out of sight. I got up and checked the hallway, but there was no one there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination. It was late, I was tired, and the house was old. But the next night, the footsteps returned. And this time they were closer to our bedroom door. I went to the door and opened it, expecting to find Jessica standing in the hallway. But the hallway was empty. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, standing by the stairs, was the woman. She was exactly as Jessica had described, tall, thin, with black hair that hung in front of her face. She was just standing there, not moving, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I froze, unable to move or speak. For a moment it felt like time had stopped. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she vanished into thin air. I ran back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was wrong with this house. That night I did some research. I searched the town records and found an old newspaper article from decades ago. It was about a woman named Sarah Montgomery who had lived in the house years before we moved in. She had gone missing, and no one had ever found out what happened to her. The article mentioned rumors that she had been seen wandering the house in the years after her disappearance, but no one had ever been able to explain it. That was the woman from my dream. That was the woman we'd been seeing. The next day, I confronted Jessica. "We need to leave," I said. "We can't stay here anymore." But she wouldn't listen. She was determined to find out what had happened to Sarah Montgomery, to figure out why she was haunting our home. I didn't know what to do. Every time we thought we were alone, she was there. We could hear her footsteps, see her shadow moving in the corners of our eyes. And no matter how many times we tried to leave, the house wouldn't let us go. One night, I woke up to find Jessica standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were wide, her expression blank. "Jess?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I reached for her shoulder, but when my hand touched her, I felt a cold chill as if her body had turned to ice. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror behind Jessica was the woman. She was standing right behind her. "Mark," Jessica whispered, still not turning around. "She's here," I ran. I grabbed Jessica and pulled her out of the room, but as we reached the door, I felt something hold me back, a cold hand. And I knew with a sickening certainty that we were never meant to leave this house.